Ambassador Wei stood before the Council of Seven Species and tried not to show his nervousness. The chamber was massive, built to accommodate beings of wildly different sizes and shapes. Floating orbs of light represented the Ashen. Crystalline structures hummed with the thoughts of the four-armed sat in seats designed for their bulk, and the clicked their mandibles in what might have been conversation. Had practiced his speech for weeks. Humanity wanted full military alliance status. They had technology to offer, soldiers ready to serve, and a desperate desire to prove themselves worthy of the galactic community. It had been 15 years since first contact, and humans were tired of being treated like children. High Arbiter Ash raised one of his four arms. The chamber fell silent. The skin shifted through colors that translator rendered as disappointment and pity. Ambassador, Ash said, his voice rumbling through the chamber. We have reviewed your application. We have studied your species extensively. We have compiled detailed reports on human neural function and behavioral patterns. Felt his heart rate increase. Something in Ash's tone warned him this wasn't going to go well. We must decline humanity's request for military alliance, Ash continued. The reasoning is not political or technological. It is biological. Humans are fundamentally unsuited for military service within the council structure. The words hit like a physical blow. Around him, the other species emanated what his translator interpreted as agreement. Some even seemed sympathetic. I don't understand, said, fighting to keep his voice steady. Human soldiers have proven themselves capable. We've served in peacekeeping operations, our combat simulations. Your soldiers perform adequately in controlled environments, Ash interrupted. But the reports reveal a critical flaw in human neurology. Your species experiences what you call anxiety. You feel fear of things that have not happened. You worry about threats that do not exist. Your brains constantly simulate disasters and trigger stress responses even when you are completely safe. An ashen orb pulsed with soft light. Through the translator, her voice sounded genuinely concerned. We studied your literature, your entertainment, your daily lives. Humans lie awake at night imagining terrible things that might never occur. You call these what-if thoughts. You experience physical symptoms of danger when there is no danger present. A crystalline structure chimed in, its mathematical mind calculating probabilities. Our analysis suggests that human decision-making is compromised by approximately 47% due to constant stress hormone production. Your neural pathways are polluted by imaginary threats. This makes humans unreliable in crisis situations. Wanted to argue, but he knew they weren't entirely wrong. He himself had spent last night unable to sleep, running through every possible way this presentation could go wrong. He'd imagined disasters that seemed ridiculous in daylight. That was just what humans did. Commander Sarah stood in the observation gallery, watching the proceedings. She was there as a military observer, though now it seemed there would be nothing to observe. She caught his eye and gave him a slight nod. They both knew what the aliens didn't understand. Ash continued, his tone almost gentle. Every species feels fear when confronted with actual threats. This is normal and useful, but humans feel fear constantly, even in safety. You worry about your health when you are healthy. You fear failure before you attempt tasks. You imagine loved ones in danger when they are perfectly safe. This chronic fear response is a psychological disorder by any civilized standard. A representative clicked rapidly. We cannot entrust the defense of council space to beings who are frightened of shadows. In battle, clear thinking is essential. Human soldiers would be paralyzed by their own imaginations. Opened his mouth to respond, but Ash raised his hand again. The decision is final. Humanity may maintain its current status as a protectorate member. You will be defended by the council fleet. But your species is too psychologically fragile for true military integration. We say this not with contempt but with compassion. It is not your fault that evolution cursed you with such neural dysfunction. the chamber filled with various sounds and emanations of agreement and sympathy. To the assembled species, this was an act of kindness. They were protecting these poor, anxiety-ridden humans from situations their damaged brains couldn't handle. Bowed slightly, maintaining his diplomatic composure. The human delegation accepts the Council's decision. We thank you for your consideration and your continued protection. He left the chamber with as much dignity as he could manage, joined him in the corridor outside. For a long moment, neither spoke. They think we're broken, finally said. They pity us, replied. They actually feel sorry for us. Laughed, but there was no humor in it. I've been in combat situations where that so-called neural dysfunction kept my entire squad alive. We survived an ambush on 442B because I couldn't stop imagining all the ways we might get attacked. I drilled my people on scenarios I'd made up in my head during anxious nights. When the real attack came, we'd already practiced for something worse. Try explaining that to beings who can't imagine threats that aren't immediately visible, said. They walked in silence back toward the human quarters. Around them, the station bustled with activity. Ships came and went. Traders haggled. Diplomats negotiated. The galactic community functioned smoothly, protected by council fleets that had never faced a serious threat. That was about to change. The first reports came in during dinner. Was picking at his food, still processing the humiliation of the day when his erupted with emergency alerts. Received them at the same moment. The Devourer swarm, read aloud. Detection confirmed at Galactic Rim. Vector indicates approach toward Council space. Pulled up the detailed reports. Her face went pale. 17 civilizations consumed. Complete biological integration of conquered populations. Hive mind structure. Estimated arrival at outer colonies in 6 months. They rushed to the emergency council session. The chamber was in chaos. Species that had seemed so confident hours ago now emanated panic and confusion. The Devourer swarm was the stuff of legends, warnings passed down from ancient species. Most had thought it was a myth. Ash tried to maintain order. Our defense fleets will establish a perimeter. We have time to prepare. Our military doctrine has served us well for thousands of years. Watched the proceedings and felt a familiar sensation in his gut. It was the feeling he got when something was wrong, when danger lurked just out of sight. His anxiety was screaming at him, running through dozens of scenarios, imagining all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. For once, he didn't try to suppress it. In a small research facility on the other side of the station, a young scientist named was reviewing footage of human soldiers in training. Had been assigned to study human psychology for the military assessment. The footage showed humans running drills, practicing combat scenarios, preparing for deployments. Something about it nagged at. The humans moved differently than soldiers from other species. They were always looking around, always checking corners, always expecting something to go wrong. Even in safe training environments, they maintained a level of vigilance that seemed exhausting. Pulled up the psychological reports. Humans spent hours planning for contingencies. They drilled for equipment failures that probably wouldn't happen. They practiced scenarios that were statistically unlikely. They prepared escape routes from their escape routes. They stockpiled supplies in redundant locations. It all seemed so wasteful, so paranoid, so inefficient. But as watched the footage again, a thought began to crystallize. These humans weren't just training for known threats. They were training for unknown threats. They were practicing for disasters they'd invented in their own anxious minds. What if that wasn't a weakness? What if that was something else entirely? Brought up the data on the Devourer swarm. The species was unpredictable, chaotic, overwhelming. It didn't follow standard combat patterns. It adapted rapidly. It exploited any weakness, any hesitation, any moment of confusion. The scientist's analytical mind began connecting patterns. Other species prepared for likely threats. They trained for scenarios based on historical data and rational assessment. They felt safe once their preparations matched the expected danger level. Humans never felt safe. They couldn't. Their brains wouldn't let them. They kept preparing, kept imagining worse scenarios, kept drilling for disasters that might never come. Against a predictable enemy, that seemed like overkill. Against something like the Devourer swarm, it might be exactly what the galaxy needed. Began composing a message to the council, but hesitated. Who would listen to a junior researcher contradicting the consensus of the galaxy's top? The decision had been made. Humans were too fearful, too anxious, too broken for military service. Outside the research facility window, ships began arriving. Council species were calling in their fleets, preparing their defenses, mobilizing their forces. They moved with efficiency and confidence. They had protocols, doctrines, and thousands of years of successful military history. They felt prepared, they felt ready. Humans would never feel ready. And maybe, thought while watching another video of human soldiers expecting attacks from every direction, that was exactly the point. 3 months passed, and the outer colonies burned. The Devourer swarm moved faster than predicted, hit harder than anticipated, and adapted to every defense the Council threw at it. Ships that had protected the galaxy were torn apart like paper. Stations fell in hours instead of days. Entire planets were evacuated in desperate retreats. The Council's military doctrine was failing. It was based on rational threat assessment, predictable enemy behavior, and historical precedent. The swarm was none of those things. It was chaos given form, hunger given purpose, and it was winning. Commander watched the casualty reports scroll across her screen and felt a horrible vindication. She'd seen this coming. Not the swarm specifically, but the failure. She'd felt it in her gut, that nagging anxiety that whispered something was wrong with the Council's confident preparations. Her fellow humans had felt it too. While other species had prepared for the threat they expected, humans had been quietly, privately preparing for something worse. It was instinct. They couldn't help it. Wei stood before the council again, but the atmosphere was completely different. The assembled species no longer emanated confidence. Fear rolled off them in waves, and they didn't know what to do with it. Most species only felt fear during actual danger, and they had no practice functioning through it. Ambassador, Ash said, and his voice cracked with something had never heard from the proud before, desperation. We find ourselves in need of human insight. Your species has experience with chronic fear. How do you function? How do you think clearly when terror clouds judgment? Looked at the assembled council. Beings who had humanity 3 months ago now looked to them for answers. The irony wasn't lost on him. You don't think clearly, said simply. You think fearfully, and you train yourself to make that work for you instead of against you. He pulled up a display showing human military doctrine. We have a proposal. Let us train your forces, not in human tactics but in human thinking. Teach them to do what our species does every day. Function while afraid, plan while anxious, and prepare for things that probably won't happen but absolutely could. The council chambers filled with uncertain murmurs. The idea seemed absurd. Let the psychologically damaged species teach their soldiers. But the casualty reports kept coming. The swarm kept advancing. And for the first time in galactic history, the mighty council was truly afraid. Ash looked at for a long moment. What would this training involve? We teach them paranoia, said, stepping forward. We teach them to assume everything will go wrong at the worst possible time. We teach them to prepare for disasters they hope never happen. We teach them what humans call worst-case scenario thinking. An ashen orb pulsed with confusion. But that sounds mentally exhausting. How can anyone maintain combat effectiveness while constantly imagining catastrophe? Smiled grimly. You'd be surprised what you can do when you never feel safe. Humans have been doing it for our entire existence. Now it's time to share that particular gift with the rest of you." The council voted. It wasn't unanimous, and many species remained skeptical. But desperation makes for strange alliances. The human delegation was granted permission to run a pilot training program with select council forces. As they left the chamber, turn to, "Are you sure about this? Teaching other species to think like us might break them." "It might," agreed. "But the swarm will definitely break them if they keep fighting the way they have been. At least this way they have a chance." Deep in the station, received notification of the council's decision. The young scientist felt a surge of something that might have been hope. Maybe the galaxy would learn what had begun to suspect, that humanity's greatest weakness was actually something far more valuable. The training was about to begin, and the galaxy was about to discover what humans had known for. Fear isn't something to be conquered or suppressed. Fear is information. Fear is preparation. Fear is survival. And humanity was about to turn it into a weapon. The training facility had been hastily converted from a cargo bay. Commander stood before the first mixed species unit assigned to the human training program. 50 soldiers from 12 different species, all handpicked by their commands as the best, and they looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Had seen that look before. Soldiers who thought they knew everything. Soldiers who had never truly been afraid. "Welcome," she said. "For the next 4 weeks, we're going to teach you something your species never evolved to do naturally. We're going to teach you to be anxious." An officer named Ash the Younger, nephew of the High Arbiter, raised one of his 4 arms. "Commander, with respect, we know how to feel fear. We're not emotionless machines." "You know how to feel fear when danger is present," corrected. "That's not the same thing. We're going to teach you to feel fear when everything seems fine. We're going to teach you to imagine disaster and plan for it. We're going to teach you to never, ever feel safe." She pulled up a tactical display showing a standard defensive position. "Tell me what you see." The soldiers studied it. An officer spoke first, its crystalline structure humming with calculation. A well-fortified position, clear, redundant power systems, supply caches within acceptable distance. This is textbook defensive doctrine. "Now let me show you what a human sees," said. She highlighted different elements of the same position. "Power systems can be sabotaged, can be obscured. Supply caches can be captured. Fortifications can be breached. The ground beneath could be unstable. The air could be poisoned. Reinforcements might not arrive. Communications might fail. Your own soldiers might panic. Your weapons might malfunction." The soldiers stared at the display, now covered in dozens of highlighted potential failure points. "That's insane," said a soldier, mandibles clicking rapidly. "You can't plan for every possible thing that might go wrong. You'd never get anything done." "Welcome to being human," replied. "And yes, you absolutely can plan for every possible thing. That's what we're going to teach you. It's exhausting, it's maddening, and it might save your life." The first week was brutal. Had the soldiers run standard combat scenarios but with a twist. Every time they started to feel confident, she introduced a random disaster. Communications went dead. Supply lines were cut. Reinforcements didn't arrive. Equipment malfunctioned. Allied forces turned out to be compromised. The non-human soldiers struggled. Their training had taught them to respond to actual threats, but they kept being by problems they hadn't anticipated. Problems that hadn't even existed until invented them. "This is pointless," Ash the Younger shouted after a particularly frustrating simulation. His 4 arms gestured wildly. "You're making up problems that would never happen in real combat." MI pulled up recent battle reports from the swarm front. Communications failure, check. Supply line disruption, check. Reinforcements delayed, check. Equipment malfunction due to biological contamination, check. Want me to keep going? The officer deflated. Every disaster had invented in simulation had actually happened in real battles. She hadn't been making things up. She'd been preparing them for reality. "How do you live like this?" asked a young Ashen named Lyra, her light flickering with distress. "Constantly imagining everything going wrong. It's exhausting just thinking about it." "You get used to it," said Sergeant Davies, a human instructor helping with the program. "Or rather, you never get used to it, but you learn to function anyway. That's the secret. We're not asking you to enjoy being anxious. We're asking you to be productive while anxious." The second week focused on what humans called stress inoculation, deliberately triggered fear responses in the soldiers and then made them complete complex tasks while terrified. The theory was simple. If you practice being afraid, fear becomes familiar instead of paralyzing. For species that only felt fear during actual danger, this was torture. Their bodies and minds weren't designed for sustained stress, but slowly, painfully, they began to adapt. Observe the training when possible, taking detailed notes. The young had been proven right to suggest human methods might help, but even was shocked by how extreme those methods were. "You're breaking them," said Tu after watching a particularly intense session. "I'm remaking them," corrected. "There's a difference. Yes, it's hard. Yes, some of them will wash out. But the ones who make it through will be able to function in situations that would paralyze traditional council forces." The breakthrough came during the third week. The mixed species unit was running a defensive scenario. They'd learned to expect disasters, so they'd prepared redundant systems, multiple escape routes, and contingency plans for contingency plans. Then hit them with everything at once. Every disaster she trained them to fear happened simultaneously. Communications died. Power failed. The enemy attacked from an unexpected direction. Their weapons malfunctioned. It was chaos. Traditional council doctrine would have collapsed. Soldiers would have waited for orders that couldn't come, relied on systems that didn't work, and frozen in the face of overwhelming unpredictability. But these soldiers had been trained by humans. They'd already imagined this exact scenario during their anxious planning sessions. Sergeant Davies had stayed up all night 3 days ago worrying about this specific combination of failures and had shared her paranoid contingency plan with the unit. They executed it perfectly. Ash the Younger took command when the ranking officer's communicator failed. Lyra the Ashen used a backup power system that seemed excessive until they needed it. A soldier deployed defensive drones that everyone had thought were overkill. Davies led half the unit through an escape route they'd planned, just in case, even though it seemed unnecessary. The simulation ended with the unit intact and the objective secured. In the observation room, Ambassador watched with satisfaction. High Arbiter Ash stood beside him, all four arms crossed. "They moved like humans," the High Arbiter said quietly, "always expecting attack, always prepared for disaster. I thought it would make them hesitant, but they moved faster than traditional units." "That's because they weren't waiting to see what would go wrong," explained. "They'd already imagined what would go wrong and prepared for it. When disaster struck, they were ready." "This is a fundamental change in how we think about warfare," Ash said. "For thousands of years, Council doctrine has been based on rational threat assessment and proportional response. What you're teaching is preemptive paranoia." "We prefer to call it worst-case scenario planning," replied. "But yes, that's accurate." More units rotated through the program. Not all of them completed it. Some species simply couldn't handle the sustained anxiety. Their neural structures weren't built for it, but enough made it through that the Council authorized expanded training. Stood before a new group of recruits and gave the same speech she'd given dozens of times now. "Welcome. We're going to teach you to be anxious. We're going to teach you to imagine disasters. We're going to teach you to never feel safe." A soldier in the front row raised a claw. "Commander, I have a question. Once we learn to think this way, can we unlearn it?" Paused. She thought about her own life, the nights lying awake imagining disasters, the constant mental rehearsal of worst-case scenarios, the inability to ever truly relax. "No," she said honestly, "you can't. This training will change how your brain works. You'll start seeing potential disasters everywhere. You'll plan for things that will never happen. You'll exhaust yourself with preparation, and you'll hate it." The recruits looked at each other nervously. "But you'll survive things that would kill traditionally trained soldiers," continued. "You'll be ready for situations no one else saw coming. You'll keep fighting when everyone else has given up. That's what humans do. That's what we're offering you." The recruits settled in, and the training began. Meanwhile, at the swarm front, things were getting worse. The Devourer had adapted to every council tactic. Traditional forces were still using doctrine designed for rational opponents. The swarm wasn't rational. It was hunger and chaos and relentless adaptation. Council casualties mounted. Planets fell faster than they could be evacuated. The defensive perimeter was collapsing. Then the first human-trained units arrived at the front. They moved differently, fought differently, prepared differently. When the swarm adapted to cut communications, these units had already practiced fighting without orders. When supplies were disrupted, they had caches hidden in places no rational military doctrine would suggest. When standard tactics failed, they switched to contingencies they'd prepared for scenarios they'd invented. The swarm wasn't used to prey that prepared for disasters that hadn't happened yet. For the first time since the war began, the swarm's advance slowed. Back at the training facility, received reports of the human-trained unit's success. He pulled up casualty figures. The numbers were still terrible, but they were significantly better than traditionally trained units facing the same threats. Ash the Younger sent a message from the front lines. It was brief. "Your paranoia is saving lives. Request full implementation of human training protocols for all Council forces." Forwarded the message to the Council with a simple note. "Humanity is ready to serve. We're still afraid. We'll always be afraid. But we know how to function through fear. Let us teach the galaxy to do the same." The Council convened an emergency session. The debate was fierce. Many species still resisted the idea of fundamentally changing military doctrine based on what they still saw as a human psychological disorder. But the casualty reports didn't lie. The swarm wasn't slowing because Council forces had gotten stronger. It was slowing because human-trained units thought like humans, paranoid, anxious, and perpetually prepared for things to go wrong. High Arbiter Ash rose to speak. "3 months ago, I stood before this council and declared humans psychologically unfit for military service. I told Ambassador that chronic fear was a weakness, a disorder, a curse. I was wrong." He gestured to the tactical displays showing the front lines. "The swarm is chaos. It cannot be predicted by rational analysis. It adapts faster than we can respond. Our doctrine, based on thousands of years of successful warfare, is failing because it assumes our enemies will be reasonable." Ash's skin shifted through colors that's translator rendered as shame and determination. Humans don't assume their enemies will be reasonable. They don't assume anything will go right. They prepare for disasters they hope never happen. And against an enemy like the swarm, that gives them an advantage we desperately need. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. The Council granted humanity full military authority, not alliance status, not partnership, full authority. Ambassador became Supreme Commander. Commander became Training Director. And humanity's entire military philosophy was uploaded to every Council military database. It wasn't just tactics and doctrine. It was a fundamental rewiring of how to think about threats. The core principles were simple but alien to most species. Assume everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Prepare accordingly. Create backups for your backups, then create backups for those. If you feel safe, you've missed something. Find what you missed. Practice being afraid until fear becomes familiar instead of paralyzing. Never, ever assume the enemy will do the rational thing. Within weeks, every council military facility had adopted human training methods. It was brutal. Many soldiers couldn't complete it. Some species simply weren't capable of sustained anxiety, but enough made it through. The galaxy was learning to be afraid, and in that fear, they were finding strength they'd never known they had. Stood in his new command center, watching deployment rosters and battle plans scroll across multiple screens. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Billions of lives depended on decisions he would make in the coming weeks. He felt terrified. His mind raced through dozens of scenarios where everything went wrong. He imagined failures, disasters, defeats, and deaths. His anxiety screamed at him about all the ways he wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't enough. For the first time in his life, didn't try to suppress those thoughts. He let them flow them and used them to refine his plans. Every fear became a contingency. Every nightmare became a drill. Every anxious thought became preparation. A junior officer approached. Supreme Commander, the final defensive line has been established at the Sigma barrier. All Council forces are in position. The swarm will reach us in 72 hours. Nodded. 72 hours to prepare for a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Most commanders would use that time to review doctrine, check supplies, and ensure readiness. Would use it to imagine every possible way they could lose. Because that's what humans did. That's what they'd always done. And now it was what the entire galaxy was learning to do. The Devourer swarm was coming. And for the first time, the galaxy would face it not with confidence, but with paranoia, anxiety, and the kind of desperate preparation that only comes from knowing, deep in your bones, that safety is an illusion. They would face it like humans, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The Sigma barrier was a marvel of engineering. Defensive stations arranged in a perfect grid across 1,000 cubic kilometers of space. Overlapping fields of fire, redundant power systems, supply caches positioned according to mathematical optimization. By traditional council standards, it was impregnable. Supreme Commander stood in the command ship and saw only vulnerabilities. The defensive grid has a 12-second gap during station rotation, he noted. Enemy could exploit that. The rotation is necessary for power management, a tactical officer replied. The probability of an enemy exploiting a 12-second gap is 0.03%. Make it 0.0%, said flatly. Extend rotation time by 8 seconds, overlap station coverage during the transition, and accept the power inefficiency. We're not playing probability games with the swarm. Around the command center, alien officers were learning that human commanders didn't care about statistical likelihood. They cared about possibility. If something could go wrong, they planned for it. Moved through the fleet, inspecting units that had completed human training. She could spot them instantly. They moved with attention that never quite left their bodies, always scanning, always checking, always preparing. Ash the Younger commanded a strike force on one of the barrier stations. He'd completed the full training program and had become, in his professional opinion, properly paranoid. "Commander," he greeted her, "we've triple-checked our systems, established 4 fallback positions, and drilled the crew on 17 different disaster scenarios." "Good," said. "Now assume you missed something and check again." Ash's 4 arms gestured in what humans had learned was amusement. "My uncle says I've become insufferable. I can't stop seeing potential problems everywhere." "Welcome to humanity," replied. "It doesn't get better, you just get more efficient at managing it." Across the fleet, similar conversations played out. Soldiers who had learned to think like humans were now teaching others. The anxiety was spreading, becoming normalized, transforming from a disorder into doctrine. worked in the research division, analyzing swarm behavior patterns, or trying to. The problem with the swarm was that it didn't follow patterns. It adapted constantly, exploiting any predictability in its enemies. That's why it's winning, realized. Every other species in the galaxy fights predictably. We have doctrine, protocols, standard operating procedures. We follow patterns because patterns are efficient. The swarm exploits those patterns. The young pulled up data on human-trained units. Their behavior was far less predictable. They changed tactics mid-battle. They abandoned perfectly good positions for reasons that seemed irrational. They did inefficient things like maintaining excessive supply caches and redundant systems. The swarm couldn't exploit patterns in forces that didn't follow patterns, not because humans were strategically brilliant, but because they were too anxious to stick to a plan when their gut said something was wrong. It's not that humans are unpredictable, noted in the research log. It's that human anxiety makes them responsive to stimuli other species ignore. They react to bad feelings and vague senses of wrongness. From an external perspective, this looks random. But it's not random. It's just responding to information processed subconsciously. The swarm arrived ahead of schedule. Of course it did, because one of many anxiety-fueled scenarios had been, what if they arrive early? And he'd positioned scouts specifically to detect early arrival. The enemy came like a tide of nightmares. Biological ships that looked like they'd been grown rather than built. Weapons that sprayed acid and fire and things that didn't have names in council languages. They moved with the coordination of a hive mind and the chaos of a natural disaster. Traditional council forces would have relied on the defensive plan, trusted the math, followed doctrine. They would have been slaughtered. But these weren't traditional council forces anymore. These forces had been infected with human anxiety. When the swarm's opening wave hit harder than expected, commanders didn't freeze waiting for new orders. They'd already imagined this scenario. Ash the Younger had drilled his crew on, what if the first wave is twice as strong? They executed the contingency plan without hesitation. When swarm bioweapons corroded hull plating faster than predicted, maintenance crews weren't caught off guard. Human-trained engineers had spent sleepless nights imagining exotic attack vectors. They'd prepositioned alternative hull sealants in 17 different locations because, what if the standard sealant doesn't work? When the command ship's main communications array was destroyed in the first 30 seconds of combat, the fleet didn't descend into chaos, had drilled them on fighting without central coordination. Each unit had prearranged signals, fallback plans, and the authority to act independently. The battle was chaos, ships exploded, stations fell. Thousands died in the first hour, but the line held and the swarm wasn't used to that. On the ground level, individual moments of human-trained anxiety saved lives. A gunner named S felt wrong about a section of empty space. No logical reason, just a feeling. Anxiety whispered that something was there. S fired into the empty space anyway. The shots revealed a cloaked swarm infiltration unit. If it had reached the station's reactor, thousands would have died. An Ashen engineer named Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that their backup power system was vulnerable. She'd checked it 3 times. It was fine. But the anxiety wouldn't stop, so she checked a 4th time and discovered a swarm biological agent eating through the insulation. She stopped it with 90 seconds to spare. A tactical officer named Al received data suggesting the enemy was retreating in Sector 7. Standard doctrine said to pursue, but Al had been trained by humans and had learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed fortunate. What if it's a trap? Al didn't pursue. The retreating, swarm forces had been luring them into an ambush. The trap failed. This happened hundreds of times across the battlefield. Soldiers listening to anxiety that whispered something was wrong, making irrational decisions based on feelings rather than data, and surviving because of it. in the command center, orchestrated the defense while simultaneously imagining its failure. Every decision was made with the assumption it was wrong. Every success was treated as a potential setup for disaster. "The swarm is pulling back in the northern quadrant," an officer reported. "Why?" immediately asked. "What are they doing that we're not seeing?" "Analysis suggests they're repositioning for—" "I don't care what analysis suggests," interrupted. "The swarm doesn't reposition, it swarms. If they're pulling back, it's because they want us to think something. What do they want us to think?" 47 minutes later, the answer became clear. The swarm had pulled back to give itself room to deploy a massive biological weapon, something that would have destroyed the northern quadrant entirely. But had already moved forces to counter the attack he'd imagined might be coming. Because he'd asked himself, what if the pullback is preparation for something worse? Days blurred together. The battle raged without.